Hi, everybody. How are you guys? Hello. Welcome. How is everybody doing? Hi, Rachel and Mateo and Kim. So happy to have you here. Kim, I'm glad you're here. And Tony and Annette and Jermaine and Naturally Me. Hello, everybody. How are you guys? I know it's a bit of a wild time for many of you. And I know we have individuals who are in here who are, working in healthcare and are super busy right now, and those of you in New York City and all of that. So if you guys want to share anything about that or how you're doing, more than welcome to. Hi, Jamie. How did the mastermind group go, Rachel? I'm curious to hear. Hi, Jody. Okay, so what I'm going to go through is a few things. Number one, I just want to mention, I noticed Rachel's organizing the mastermind groups, which is amazing for everybody. So if you guys want to tune in and be there for the masterminds as well that are happening this week, then, oh, that's so nice, Rachel. I'm so happy. Then, it seems to be going really great. And I put some worksheets in there for you guys to sort of practice and use and see if those are helpful. And if there are any sort of tools or things you guys want me to add as well, let me know and I will put those in there too. So hi, Kelly and Efrat. Hello. And Shannon. Hi, Shannon. So as usual, I'm going to go through and answer some questions. I feel like the questions are just getting progressively more insightful week to week, which is really cool for me to see because I can just see how much you guys are really cementing the information. There start to be stages in here where, like, some of the questions are sort of like secondary questions. It's not really about the information anymore, but basically how you're using the information in real life and things you're noticing as a result. And I can tell when these questions start to happen. And honestly, there are a great number of these coming up this week. Like one of the, I'll go through a couple of them, but here's the structure for today. So today we're going to be talking about trust and forgiveness and sort of repairing and rebuilding trust in relationships. This is something that you guys sort of mentioned a lot, and there's going to be a feature, I know Jake was mentioning this, and we talked a lot about the boundaries and people pleasing, but there are also really important boundaries that we need when we are trying to specifically work through trust. So trust, honesty, commitment, we're going to dive into, and I'll go through some content about that today. And I'm also going to add like an area about, as we rebuild trust, a boundary work process. Now this boundary work process shows up in the Relationship Mastery course. And the Relationship Mastery course is essentially like the course about how to be secure. It's like all the things that you need in a relationship in order to be secure. I wish I sort of phrased it differently or positioned it differently for you guys, because I can see some of the like who's completed what courses, and I can see like tons of people doing all the different attachment style courses, and then a lot less people doing the Relationship Mastery course. So I'm going to add some more stuff in there about like how to be secure, and then I'm going to make sure that that's like sort of positioned in there because I noticed that that's one of your guys' needs. Also, we've started sending surveys out in batches. So surveys about what you guys want to see more of. Yeah, that's an amazing idea. Can you do a webinar about how attachment styles change as you become more secure? Yes, that's an amazing idea. I'm actually going to just write that down. So you guys have such fantastic ideas. It's so helpful for me just to like always grow and expand, not just the platform, but how attachment styles change. So not just the platform, but also the content I create in general, and to sort of see what's working for you guys in this entire journey. So hi, Pinka. Hello, Halima. And Paul, hello. How are you? Wow, I'm so happy to hear that. That's really nice, Kim. And I love what Kelly said. You are not alone. Yeah, I know it's not the easiest time. So I'm also going to hold space at the end for any like COVID related questions that you guys want to talk about, just in terms of, hi, Shayna, just in terms of, how to make the most of your time emotionally during social distancing and during this time when some of our needs are naturally unmet because there are all these pivots happening in our lifestyle at this moment. So I will dive into some of the initial questions here, and then we can dive into the trust-related content, the boundary work process that I'm going to go through. It won't be the same as before. Like it's not about boundaries and the importance of boundaries and how they come about or how we have poor boundaries. It's about like an actual step-by-step system you can use to set boundaries if you find that it's something that's coming into your life that's a bit of a struggle. So on that note, there was a question I really wanted to start off with. And I'm just seeing if I can find it here, because it was sort of a great question to kickstart this discussion, but it seemed to have moved when I updated my browser. Okay, so this is the question. So this question's from Amanda, and this is what I meant by sort of like, oh, you guys are really integrating the content. So Amanda's question is, hello, I'm working through the shadow work course at the moment and have a question. Sometimes I notice that many people are triggered by the same person. Does this mean that the society we live in tells us to repress the traits that person has? And should we still integrate traits within ourselves if it would be judged by our culture for it? So I was like, reading this question, I'm like, wow, you very much obviously are understanding the shadow work course, and you're able to sort of pull this out big picture and apply it to systems and how society and culture is and all these different things. And then this person goes on to say, also, I've seen many materials saying that women should connect with their feminine energy, and was wondering what your opinion of this is. Okay, so wonderful questions. So first and foremost, yes, the answer is absolutely yes. If somebody triggers multiple people, chances are they have a lot of traits that are naturally judged as bad in society. Like if we think, I want to sort of bring up the power of this idea of collective agreements that we make societally. And obviously this changes country to country, but there are a lot of collective agreements we make globally at the same time. So a really easy analogy of this is like money. Like money as paper or money as numbers on a computer screen doesn't actually have any like intrinsic value, right? It's if you think of just removing all your beliefs about money is only pieces of paper, what's represented by a piece of plastic, a card that you have, or numbers on a computer screen. But it's the intrinsic collective agreements we've made about money that give it its power. And so, to sort of position that as an analogy, it's sort of like the same thing. We can have these collective agreements about that selfish people are bad, or arrogant people are frustrating, or, we can have these collective agreements that exist. Now, if you see that and you look at those triggers and you're like, okay, I don't want to become like that person, so I'm afraid of integrating my shadow. That's not what shadow work will do. If you see somebody as arrogant or selfish, let's just say, because I remember that was a question asked last time, and it triggers you, the ideal state you want to be in is to be able to observe traits in other people and make non-charged judgments. Like, not even non-charged judgments. Take the word judgment out. Observations. So you might be able to say, I notice that person can behave that way sometimes, but it's probably because of something that they're going through or something in their past, and you're not really judging it or feeling the need to gossip about it. You might check in, and if you're going to partner with that person on a project, or you're going to do something with somebody where you commit to something in your life, you might check in and like really observe and see, is this the right decision? And you can practice like precaution. Absolutely. And so that natural observation can definitely serve, but it's the charged judgment that tends to make a really big deal. That's when we're just suffering unnecessarily. And wherever there's a charged judgment, something is still too much in your shadow, and chances are you're out of balance in that area. So if you get charged on people who are selfish or arrogant, chances are you're keeping yourself too small and you're not able to take yourself fully into consideration in a lot of situations. And so that person triggers in you something about how you treat yourself, right? You're overly putting other people on a pedestal and not bringing yourself into consideration. And that's why it bothers you. And that person triggers you because they represent something inside of you that might be in the totally inverse form, but that's there and needs some integration so that you can bring it back into balance. So you can see somebody being arrogant or selfish, just as this analogy, but it's not something that you have to worry about because you trust yourself to set your own boundaries around that person, to not take what they're doing personally, to not feel minimized or not good enough so that their presence doesn't further make you feel that way. And you're able to just observe and be like, oh, okay, this person may be behaving this way, but it's not infringing in that interaction with you in any way that's painful. And that's the idea of shadow work. That's what our shadow is always showing us. These parts of ourselves that need integration, not to be, so that we can start exemplifying those traits, but so that we can be in a space of balance and not be triggered by those things. And next, I sort of have a similar answer about women connecting with their feminine energy. Like, I think anything we're repressing, I think all men and all women have both masculine and feminine energy and masculine and feminine traits according to the way that we've been conditioned in society. And I think if we're actively repressing anything, or we can find any points of repression in ourselves, then those things will definitely become problems. So shadow work is a great place to bring that into at the same time. So I hope that that's a helpful answer. Hi, Annette and Stacy and Ella. I agree about the changing in attachment styles. I decided to take the quiz. I was taking the breakup well and got 55% secure. That's amazing. I was previously there. Yeah, but Princess Con, I've seen some of the questions you ask in here and how you're handling things in terms of the breakup and the things you said, especially in that last webinar. Like, you can tell that you're becoming more secure. I would have told you that without the quiz. But that's so amazing, and I'm happy to hear that. And wonderful, Mateo. I'm glad. So we'll go through a couple of other questions in here. Okay, so Jeanette says, I am currently listening to the advanced, hi Jeanette, the advanced FA attachment style course, the 6 stages of a relationship. I think I might be in the power struggle, hopefully moving towards the stability stage. I checked in with my partner, who I believe is more secure, and we both agreed that things are going well. We rarely have arguments, but I do have arguments in my own head. I think everybody can relate to that at some point in their lives, right? I don't always go to him to regulate my emotions, because I believe I have to be able to do the regulation whenever I can. There are things that I do, I think it might be a typo, that make me feel extremely uncomfortable with myself. I often go to his social media and look through his old pictures with his ex. I would then compare myself to her, and even though I don't think badly of myself, I still usually don't feel good afterwards. Even at times when I feel okay, I'm not so bad compared to her. I would continue to look at their old pictures until I feel bad and anxious. Then I would disconnect with my partner until I'm able to regulate my emotions and physical reactions again. This behavior frustrates me a lot. But I often have the urge to do this over and over. I wonder if you have any explanations about why I engage in this behavior. Okay, so great question. And thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable, because I think that, everybody can relate to probably all parts of that at some point in their journey, right? So first and foremost, when we're doing something incessantly, like whenever there's something we keep repeating or going back to, like, see how the way you describe this, it's like this behavioral pattern, it's happening consistently and habitually. What this is almost always telling us that there's some subconscious need that we're trying to get met in the situation. So you might go there trying to get the need met for certainty, or for understanding, or for depth of connection in this strange way where you might be curious to hear more about his relationship or understand why it didn't work. And so your brain goes there to try to figure out the answers and the details, but then you just end up in this comparison loop. So I want you to ask yourself, what needs am I trying to get met through this situation? Because it's almost as if your conscious mind knows better, but your subconscious keeps trying to go there to get something out of it. And then what are some healthier ways that you can get this need met? And it sounds like you're doing a great job by regulating your emotions first so that you're not bringing it into the relationship. But there's still that problematic sequence where you are going there, which hurts you, and then having to pull away because you're feeling sort of the whiplash of having gone there. So I think that one of the most important things you can do first is write in one sort of column on your paper any need you can possibly think of that your subconscious mind might be trying to get met through doing that. And then in the next sort of column on your paper, write updated strategies to get this need met. So, what conversations do you need to have with him? Maybe you need to ask why the relationship ended, why it didn't work out. Is he happy in the situation with you? Is he as happy in this relationship as some of his previous relationships? Or is there anything that he's missing? And And you can bring up that same conversation and share those same things. So it's this nice, like, mutual exchange. Maybe you want to check in with the relationship and be like, hey, are your needs met? How are we feeling about things? How can we improve? How can we grow? See if you notice any pattern around what triggers you to do it. Are you triggered to do it when you feel emotionally disconnected in the relationship and you're trying to more deeply understand what makes him feel connected? There can be so many reasons, but look for the patterns that trigger the behavior, see what leads up to it, and see what you can take from that. And try to question any stories you're telling yourself in the comparison, okay? So if you're telling yourself, she's this person and I'm this person, or, whatever painful things, question those things and try to equilibrate those stories so that you're not just like going down this painful rabbit hole. And then lastly, that bigger exercise, see what updated needs you can get met by understanding what brings you back to this process over and over again. And it's sort of the background or the backstory for why we can end up in these patterns is, we go to things and we don't realize that they're causing a subconscious pain because, we're sort of going there thinking one thing, and it's sort of like our conscious and subconscious might have different intentions for us and can be working against each other. And that can be kind of a painful experience. So, I'm going to go through a couple other questions in here and then we'll dive into the content for today. So Free says, what is it that makes sex difficult for DAs sometimes? I know it is vulnerability, and that might be one cause, but more specifically, do they start ruminating? Great question. I love how you wanted to really break it down into specifics. But more specifically, do they start ruminating, having trauma thoughts and disconnecting? Do they start asking themselves whether it feels right and is the wrong person? They do not have feelings for their partner, etc. Or is it something else? Is it connected to the commitment fear? Can sex be really good for a DA in a close, vulnerable relationship if they work on themselves? What can they do to prevent anxiety and the trauma thoughts from interfering in the heat of the moment? How can the partner help? Great questions. Okay, so number one, I definitely see a very strong pattern between a dismissive avoidant becoming more comfortable in vulnerability and then feeling more connected during sex and being more open to having sex, okay? So is that part of it? Absolutely. There's a very strong correlation to working through that and then sex being directly impacted, even if there was never any mention in a session, in a consulting session, or anything that people were doing in their relationship about sex. Even if it was just purely talking about vulnerability, it can improve the relationship sexually for sure. And there's been a lot of consistency around that I've seen. Now, I think that it's more the core wounds. I'm not sure that they're ruminating as much. I think it's more this sort of quick response from the conversations I've had with people. And it's more like this quick response of feeling trapped or feeling like if they're not super, it's interesting, right? If you think about sex and you think about couples and sex, and I've had many, many conversations with couples about sex, and I would say rarely people talk about sex and they're like, oh, I couldn't wait to have sex and I was so in the mood to have sex as soon as my partner wanted to all the time. I don't think this usually happens for a lot of people. I think life is busy and people have kids running around a lot of the time, or they have busy, demanding schedules and there's lots of pressure. And, sometimes one person wants to initiate sex and the other person isn't really in the mood, but can be present in the interaction. Maybe you start off as, kissing, and then, it feels nice to kiss. And then you one person who wasn't initiating sort of maybe takes a little bit of time to warm up to the situation, men and women. But what I would say is generally, because dismissive avoidants are a little bit more disconnected from their body, they live very much in their heads and they're not really rooted in their body. Usually they are less warmed up to being interested in having sex. So, if their partner is initiating, and usually I see the problems with dismissive avoidance in sex in when the partner initiates sex and the dismissive avoidant doesn't feel like it, that's when there tends to be the most problems, right, or challenges. And I think what happens is the dismissive avoidant feels a little bit trapped in the situation because they're not necessarily in the mood, and then because they're not in their body, and it takes them a little bit of time to be present and get out of their heads. And then by the time that happens, they feel like the person is sort of forcing something or pressuring something, come on, what's going on? And And then they feel trapped or helpless or powerless, and all these core wounds that they have are triggered. And so then they get really in their head. And I've had these conversations with a lot of dismissive avoidance over the years, and they're all sort of like the same theme at the root, if that makes sense. A lot of them will tell me like how much in their head they get, and then sex just isn't enjoyable because they're like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not interested in having sex? Or why am I struggling to get in the mood to have sex? And they get really in their head. What does my partner think of me? They're trapping me. I don't want to be here right now. All these things. So I think it's really this not wanting to be vulnerable, having difficulty getting into the body and being present in interactions, getting out of their head. And then also getting into their head further, triggered because those core wounds come up. And then a lot of those things create deactivating patterns, which essentially just keep fueling that cycle of not so wonderful thoughts. And so I think the combination for all those things together is what creates that output. And so when dismissive avoidants feel comfortable in vulnerability, are working through their core wounds very, very well, and then are practicing mindfulness techniques. This is like the work I've done with dismissive avoidance when they are working on like how to be present in their body and more open to sex, in like healthy ways, of course. It's a lot of like mindfulness and anchoring. Like, can I be present? Can I remember to be in my body throughout the day? Like just these techniques that are helping them be connected to themselves. And I think that translates into everything else. So I think sex is almost like the symptom of other underlying problems. So wonderful questions. So here is the last question we're going to go through. So, there's two questions actually that are really good. So, Bill says, hi, Thais. In one of your webinars, you mentioned that one way to use criticism to empower ourselves is to see it as a gift. I have a hard time seeing criticism as a gift because one of my highest human needs is safety and security. I equate criticism to mean that what I do is not good enough, and because of this, I will be rejected or abandoned, which feels extremely unsafe. How can I turn this around and consciously reprogram myself to use criticism to empower me when this directly contradicts my highest subconscious human need for safety or security? I love this question. I am having a hard time questioning the story and meaning around criticism because of my subconscious need to feel safe and secure, and my biggest core wound in life is the pain of rejection and abandonment. So this is like another really great question of where I'm seeing people start to really understand these processes. So what I want to point out here is that, hi, Rose. So what I want to point out here is a really wonderful question that Bill is asking, because I wonder if you guys notice this, but he's basically saying my stories, my thoughts and beliefs, and my needs are contradicting one another. And this is one of the biggest challenges to be in. This is like Rachel, I answered your last question too in a video, and I put that inside the school. It was similar to, you were saying like, what if I'm going to touch on that actually here as well, because it's connected, but I put the link just before we started the webinar. I had it on private for like 3 days, but I just put the link in the, your other question inside the forum. So we can get in this space where it's like, okay, our needs and our beliefs are rubbing up against each other. And this is one of the biggest, usually, spaces that people can struggle or get stuck, and a hard place to break through. So here's what we're going to do. We're really going to like dive into each part. Okay. So what I mentioned, just to give a reference to anybody who didn't see this webinar where we talked about this, is there's this wonderful quote that I read in a book. And I can't even remember what the book was, to be honest, at this point. But I remember reading it and being like, wow, and like writing down the quote. It was like a line. I think I get more from random lines from books than the actual quotes. But the line was, criticism is an immense gift for those who are interested in self-realization. And the idea is that if we can learn to practice changing our associations to criticism, we get this opportunity for, like, if somebody comes up, for example, and criticizes me, one practice that I take on and practice as a person is, instead of just like reacting, it's like, okay, they're saying this and this is coming into my reality for a reason. Like, is this a blind spot I don't realize? Is there like a really cool golden nugget here for me that I'm not learning about myself or I'm not seeing? And so I'll try to take criticism and be like, okay, is this true for me? Because sometimes people are just projecting, and sometimes people are angry about something else or having a bad day and, can throw a jab that's not really meant for you. But other times people might have really valuable insight and feedback. And so I always try to really consider the criticisms I get and really like listen to them and see if there's something in it for me, because it's a great opportunity for learning. And so that was what we were sort of talking about. And if we can reposition criticism that way in our minds, we also, lose a lot of that unnecessary pain from fearing criticism or from the sting of criticism when we take criticism as rejection. So specifically here, Bill's case is he's saying, this, I make this mean, I equate criticism to mean that what I do is not enough, and because of this, I will be rejected or abandoned, which feels extremely unsafe. So criticism means I'm not enough. Can I 100% know that? So look at I'm just going to take you through some layers here. And this is something you guys, I'm going to get you guys to like really sit and ponder these questions as I ask them together. Okay. So can I 100% that criticism, somebody criticizes me, and that means that I'm not enough as a human being? Okay. Or is it possible that even the most, and I don't love to go by like societal validation or societal expectations, but let's imagine somebody in our minds that we like have on this big pedestal. Maybe it was like a role model you had growing up. Maybe it was like some kind of leader that was like a spiritual leader, or, a teacher that you went to school with, or, even think of like those times you're a little kid and you had that teacher you loved. It was whatever it is. Try to look at like these different figures or people. Maybe it was your mom or dad. They were like your hero, and I want you to ask yourself, do you think they've been criticized? Do you think this person has been criticized before in their lives? And if so, did that criticism make that person not enough at their core? And we'll probably find the answer is no, right? Every human being has been criticized. And so that's like sort of illusion number one, that criticism means that we're not enough. Criticism, sometimes the people who are the most enough from societal expectations are the people who have been criticized the most for a long period of time. Or sometimes the people who are more in the public light just happen to be criticized even more because they're there and their vulnerabilities are shown, right? So I would question the layers there. And then the next piece in here is that criticism means, so Bill goes on to say, and because of this, I will be rejected or abandoned, which feels extremely unsafe. So Bill's core wound or core need is being perceived to be taken away because these beliefs are leading up to it, right? So then there's this part in here where it's like, I will be rejected or abandoned, which feels extremely unsafe. Okay. So he's got like these layers. He goes, criticism means I'm not enough, means I will be rejected or abandoned. So we've got criticism, story, and then my need for safety will be taken away. So it's like belief and thought, then need. Okay. So your next belief and thought pattern is I will be rejected or abandoned. So criticism will get me rejected or abandoned, like just gotten rid of by the person who's criticizing me. And can you rub anything against that? Can you question that or invalidate that? Can you truly know that with certainty? One thing I think of is like, if I'm taking the time to give somebody any part of my personal opinion in a way that could become critical, it's not really a fun feeling to like have to go criticize somebody or give them, even if it's like just critical feedback, right? To say, hey, this thing over here is not working, or, hey, I really need you to be doing more of this. It's not a fun feeling to have to go into a potential for conflict doing that. So usually people are doing that because they're somewhat invested in the relationship. And this is the first thing that comes to mind from my end, right? So see what comes up for you guys. Like why else might somebody be criticizing? And how many times do you think people have been criticized by their loved ones, but not abandoned, right? And what are times in your personal life, if you're doing this work right now with me, or if you're Bill, and you've been criticized, but nobody abandoned you, right? They still stuck around, or they loved you anyways. Or so try to work through those stories there, okay? And then we're going to even flip the safety part on its head. We're going to try to look for all the reasons that criticism actually might make you more safe long-term. So for example, well, criticism will help me learn about myself so I can grow more, so I can change the way I adapt to relationships in my work environment and my home environment. And it's through that growth and understanding and sort of enlightenment or realization of different things in my life day to day that I empower myself and have a better chance of not being rejected and abandoned. Because if I stay stagnant, any like internal problems or programs I have that don't line up with somebody else, if I'm unwilling to move or change them, it's probably going to break relationships apart more long term. So really try to like go through that. So how can criticism actually give you safety long term? And then how can resisting criticism or not being open to criticism actually make me the most unsafe? And so what are the drawbacks essentially of not receiving criticism? What would my life have looked like this entire time if I never got any criticism from anybody? What would I be? You'd probably still be like almost childlike in your behavioral development, which probably isn't the safest thing in your adult life. So dive into those things. And I hope that's a good example for you guys who are doing like some of the reprogramming work and the emotional processing tool to really see like how this process can sort of be peeled apart. So really wonderful question. Okay, last question I'm going to go through here is from Jake. And Jake says, I had a situation take place and I'm having trouble figuring out how to approach a situation. My ex, who's a fearful avoidant leaning DA, myself, FA leaning AA, recently moved back due to the coronavirus and Peace Corps sites being evacuated. She came over. We live about an hour apart to get out of the house, and we had some drinks, which actually led to a very good conversation about the end of the relationship. She heard me out on the struggles and difficulties I had with the end of the relationship, and I really couldn't have hoped to have a better discussion. That's so wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that. At the end of the evening, I decided to ask, now that she is back, whether she felt or had any interest in the future of the two of us, to which she didn't have an answer. We also made plans to hang with her family to play some board games the weekend, and we texted a bit back and forth, and she said she would like to discuss my question while it was over. I ended up sleeping over because the board game was still going on, and we had some drinks. The next morning, we ended up getting into a conversation which basically led to her saying she doesn't know. She went on to say she has this opportunity now to be single and really dive in and explore herself now that she's back and has nothing going on. I think that this is really beautiful that she wants to explore herself. My only issue is this is the same thing she told me when we broke up. Yet she ended up dating a guy in the Peace Corps afterwards. I don't know how long or the circumstances under which this started. Also doing some serious work not to place meaning or stories on that. Good job. My question is, how do I come across as supportive but also express to her that it is hard for me to trust those words when they've already been shown not to be true or reliable? Okay, great question. So number one, I think this is more about how you choose to show up, because sometimes when people like are confused themselves, they can say like this thing over here and then this thing over here, and they might feel that at the time, but until like people have really thought through decisions, sometimes we say things emotionally like, yeah, I just need to figure things out, or I just want to be on my own, but then we feel something different and then things change. And so it sounds like she hasn't done a lot of self-exploration yet, that she's sort of new to it. So in that case, maybe I wouldn't like trust everything she's telling you right now. She seems very unclear. And so I think the best thing you can do in this situation is definitely like question the stories around it and all these different things. But I think the best thing you can do is focus on like how you want to show up. So here she is. You have been amazing, I think, in everything that you're doing here. You're an amazing community member. You're extremely wise, insightful, doing this work, working hard on yourself, like learning, growing in so many ways. And, is it fair for her to keep an amazing person like you just like kind of hanging? And obviously like there's a little bit of her leading you on, right? Like she's staying up late with you and having some drinks and having these emotional bonding conversations and, all these really mixed messages, which I think is really just a direct reflection of her probably still having feelings, but then also having all these other things going on inside. And so she's mixed, and that's why she's giving you the mixed messages. So what I would say is if anybody's in this situation, you want to make this about like, what do I deserve in this situation? And what are my boundaries? And how can I get really clear about what those are in the situation? So what is fair to me? At what point am I betraying myself by not being clear about my own feelings and needs? And so you might say to her, hey, I obviously have feelings. I'm obviously, invested and happy to connect and happy that we're communicating so well. And congratulations on that, by the way, because those are the tough conversations to have, right? So good job on that work. But, at the same time, how long am I going to allow myself to be led on for if she's not sure where she stands? And how much time will I give to her when she's not certain about what she wants before it's unfair to myself? How much emotion will I invest in her? What are my emotional boundaries? What are my time boundaries? What are my thought boundaries? How much am I going to allow myself to ruminate and think about her during the day? And I would get conscious about your boundaries in all those areas. And I would communicate those to her. I might say something like, hey, I obviously have feelings. I'm invested in this connection and the relationship and wanting to work things out. I think it's feasible. We've already had some amazing progress and conversations. But if you're not on board, I'll keep that door open for a week or two. But if you're not on board, then I have to close the door because I have to be fair and respecting towards myself and all the progress that I'm making. And I think this is the best approach in these sorts of situations. So really great question and good luck with that. Keep us posted. I didn't want to pause the webinar to watch it. I relate to my DA described it as a fear that I would pin him down. He is 6'4" and I'm 5 feet even. Yeah, it's dismissive avoidance. Like really, it's not a physical, like they feel physically threatened, but it's such a great example of that because dismissive avoidance, they just really don't want to feel like trapped in an environment or circumstances. A lot of them struggle and have these like sort of wounds or fears around like claustrophobia or enclosed spaces or all these different things. And it's this big, like a mental emotional block because I think they probably felt trapped in their environment a lot in childhood. And so it's this reprojecting from the past. Thanks for sharing that because it's just such a good example, And I think, people will not feel alone through hearing that. So Annette says, I'm the opposite. Sometimes I'm like the opposite. Sometimes I feel that I'm really eager to hear criticisms. And even though I feel like it's coming from a healthy place, do you think any of it is strangely related to wanting to hear negative things about myself, like trying to validate my negative core beliefs? I think sometimes the mind wants certainty. So it's like if somebody just says these things, it gives me certainty. I know what's actually going on. But I think overall, the mind, because we're wired for attachment, does hurt when we're hearing these things. Like I think that it never feels like really good, if that makes sense. So sometimes there are other needs being met through criticism, like certainty. Sometimes the mind can want to be pushed away by people because it's a subconscious comfort zone and it reinforces the stories we have about ourselves and it creates safety. Like, see, I always knew that these relationships wouldn't work out, or I always knew this, that, and the other. So, there can be some of those things. But that's your mind feeding on itself, honestly. If we're in that sort of cyclical space, I've been there in the past. I think every human being has been there. Those are the things we want to catch and not hold space for anymore, because those are the things that are like self-defeating and painful and the opposite of gentleness and kindness and compassion towards ourselves, which are just absolute necessities on the healing journey. So I hope that makes sense to you. It's an excellent question. Rose says, I think the presentation of the criticism is important, as well as the ratio of criticism to comments. Oh, the ratio of criticism to comments that are positive. Absolutely. I agree. The more there's a positive connection in a relationship, the more space people always have. I've seen this in like couples work for so long. The more space people have for criticism and they don't personalize it as much. So if you're on the rocks and then you start criticizing somebody all the time, that doesn't usually get taken very well. However, if you're validating each other and you've got a secure space in your relationship, then when there's time for a criticism and there's something needs to be worked on, obviously it's received significantly better. So great questions. What does the DA typically feel when they have a crush? The DA usually takes much longer to develop feelings than any other attachment style. Or if they do, they experience it in like spurts a lot of the time, like feelings, and then they retract and kind of deny those feelings to themselves. And then feelings again, and then they retract and deny those feelings to themselves again. So that tends to be the cycle that I see. So great questions, you guys. Okay, so let's talk about trust and the actual relationship around trust. So I'm just going to chug some water for a second. I'm so thirsty. Oh, I ate this soup for dinner that my partner made, and it was like delicious, but I felt like it didn't have enough flavor, so I added some like salt to it at the end, and I think I added too much salt, and I'm like dying of thirst. Okay, so let's talk about trust. So, fearful avoidance obviously generally struggle the most with trust. And I think a lot of fearful avoidance think I can't even repair trust because it's not possible. Once trust is broken, it's impossible to turn around. And everybody's really entitled to say, hey, once trust is broken in a specific area, like some people have really hard boundaries and non-negotiables. Like if somebody lies about something really important, if somebody cheats in a relationship, if, whatever those things are, sometimes people in those areas will feel like, okay, trust has been broken. The non-negotiables are these things, and you're entitled to that. That's just a boundary, okay? But there are a lot of couples who go through things, especially in like long-term relationships or marriages, where trust is going to be challenged at different times. And so in order to rebuild trust, we first have to really clearly define what trust is. And then I'm going to take you guys through a bit of a process about what we can do if we're facing a big pain point to trust. And as you're sitting here and you're participating in this webinar, I want you to sit and sort of bring up in your mind the person or the people who you feel like trust has been violated with the most in your life, and pick somebody who you want to repair it with, so you can apply some of these tools and shift some of these perspectives and become aware of some of these patterns in relationship to something that's personally, specifically going to benefit you in your life. So first and foremost, trust is usually based on two core things in any relationship, whether it's with a friendship, a family member, a romantic partner, one of your children, anything like that. So trust is number one, based on congruency. Okay. It's like if you come to my home and I say, yeah, every time you come over, I'll grab you a cup of tea. And then I keep saying that I'm going to grab you a cup of tea when you come over, but I always forget and I never do. You're not going to trust me to grab you a cup of tea. You might trust me with a whole bunch of other things, but not that. And so when we are feeling distrust in a relationship, if it is a relationship that we want to solve a problem with, we have to define specifically where that distrust is. So I'll get to that in 1 second. So trust is based on number one, congruency. And number two, this belief that the person that you're in this trusting relationship with will take you into consideration as they make choices. So for example, if you have a joint bank account with your spouse and they're like, I feel like buying a new car, and you guys have a monthly budget, the person's probably violating your trust if they just go buy a new car and they come home and they're like, hey, I got a new car today with our money. What do you think? Right? So there can be these dynamics or situations where when somebody is not taking you into consideration, that's going to be what's violating trust. Now, obviously, those same things happen with lying, right? Obviously somebody's not thinking about how this would impact you in the relationship if they found out that you were dishonest, or if you found out that they were dishonest. And infidelity, right? Like what do people do when that happens? That, the relationship, the things I hear the most about why infidelity hurts people is that it's like, we built this connection together, this relationship together, we did all these things together, and that wasn't taken into consideration. Like that wasn't valuable enough to you in that moment to be able to think differently or approach a situation differently. And these are the things that we'll hear, right? So that being said, that's what trust is. One really big problem I see people running into in whatever relationship it is when they're trying to rebuild trust is going like this. People go, oh, this person lied about that thing. I don't trust that person at all. And I see, especially in like marriages, that, I've seen an example I use around this that's really clear is a woman I was speaking with once, and her husband was the primary he was like the only one working in the household, and he never missed a day at work, and he was a good father and good with their kids and all these different things, but he would really drink a lot, like binge drink a lot and kind of black out on weekends and kind of have all these messy things going on. And she was like, I don't trust him at all anymore. And he wouldn't lie about drinking, but he would just go and get too drunk all the time, and he sort of lie by omission, right? Like have some alcohol in his soda during the day, at home. These different sort of like obviously violations of trust. And when there was a problem and they were talking about it. So So she said, I don't trust him at all as a person. And when you do that, when we put this like distrust stamp on people, it becomes that much more challenging. It becomes almost impossible to heal because it's like, I just don't trust you as a human being. And then it's like, well, how can you get past that? But if you can define the very specific area where trust has been threatened, now it becomes a solvable problem. And you'll hear me say this a lot because I'm going to push this message a lot, because when we can start thinking like this, it's very transformational in our lives, if transformational is a word. But one of the most important things whenever we have a problem is we have to isolate what that problem is. That's the first step to healing anything, is like get really clear and isolate like what is the issue? What is the core of this issue specifically? And once we do that, once we're like, okay, this is the core issue, the next step is to figure out what is the root problem that causes this issue. Because if we just address an issue at its surface level, at its symptom level, we're going to have a tough time getting ahead in any area of our life, right? So I'll go into a couple other things really quick before we go into like the tools to rebuild trust and to change trust. So again, pick somebody in your mind right now that you want to work on rebuilding trust with. And rebuilding trust also doesn't mean that like you're letting that person back into your life if they're an unhealthy character, right? This isn't like rebuild trust with the person who like hurt your pets. Like we're clear, right, about the boundary here. That's a really horrible example. So it was the first thing that came into my head. Okay. A few things that rebuild trust. Open communication builds trust. The more vulnerability we bring into relationships, we build trust. If people don't take accountability for things, destroys trust. One of the most important things we can do as human beings, if you're the one that made a mistake, is be accountable. It's almost impossible to truly move through things if accountability isn't a piece of the puzzle. Okay, so check in for a moment before we dive into like how to fix rebuilding trust for somebody else. Look at your life for a moment. These aren't easy, this isn't for the faint of heart, but look at your life. And I want you to look in the 7 areas of life, in your career, in your finances, in your mental, emotional life, your spiritual, physical, and financial, and or in relationships, so friends, family, partner, unless people are into polyamory, which is totally acceptable. But look at these different areas of your life. And I want you to ask yourself, where am I incongruent? Or where is somebody in my life causing me pain in their incongruency? Because it's something that matters. Like if you come to my home and I forget to bring you tea, that might not be a big deal for you. It might be like, wow, she's very forgetful about tea, but it may not be a huge thing. If there's your boss and you keep asking for a raise and he just constantly is like, yeah, we'll get a raise in a year. And then a year comes and you're, another year, then that might be a trust issue. So go there and ask yourself, where are you incongruent, or where is somebody in your life incongruent? Okay. So when we're looking at if trust is broken, number 1, isolate the very specific problem. Where has trust been broken for you in your life? Okay. It just like that example of the woman with her husband. It wasn't her husband being, terrible to the kids, leaving them out on the street when he's supposed to be paying the bills. It wasn't like this whole character, who he was, that was this distrustful person. It was that he had a problem in a very specific area. And if we really want to fix something, we have to dial into that area. In fact, if we want to try to fix something, if we want to see if there's hope to fix something, we have to dial it in. Okay. Sometimes you'll get there and you'll do this work and you'll be like, okay, this person keeps still not showing up. And, even if this isn't the biggest thing, this isn't the person as a whole, this one area, it's too painful for me and I have to set a boundary and walk away. But you're not going to know that and be able to walk away guilt and regret free and heal faster along the way if you don't dive right into that thing head first initially and give yourself the chance to truly see it for yourself. So when you walk away, you just know with certainty that that's the right decision. Okay. So, number 1, isolate the problem. Number 2, look for the root of the problem. We cannot, let's use some specific examples. Let's say that the trust issue is something like a partner spending over the budget. Okay. if we just get angry at the partner, and let's say this is your spouse, okay? So let's say you have 2 young children, it's your spouse. This isn't like the easiest situation, or it's one of your parents that you are supporting, or whatever it is. Let's say it's something specific where this isn't like a quick, it's not like your friend down the street who borrows money all the time and you can just be like, hey, no way. Let's say there's like an intertwinement here. So we're going to make it a more difficult situation than it is usually. And I'm sure everybody has at least a situation like this in their life. And if this is the case, I want you to see the example of like looking for the root. So if you just go to the person and you just criticize them for spending over the budget, how do you think they're going to respond? Well, they're going to naturally have that wire tripped of defensiveness, because our subconscious associations to criticism from childhood are like, I'm being attacked, I lose, I'm defenseless, I feel helpless, but I'm going to try to defend myself to protect myself in some form. So the brain isn't like, when we feel attacked, looking at listening or hearing things or working through things. The brain is looking at, how can I survive the situation? So it's in one ear and out the other, right? So number one, we want to be able to not just like criticize the surface symptom. We have to go into the underlying roots and have a conversation there. So we might go, okay, what would cause somebody to spend over the budget? And maybe you ask the person, why do we keep breaking the budget? Why do you keep spending over the budget? And maybe the person's like, I'm feeling empty, or I'm feeling unappreciative, but we need to hold space and create that dynamic of vulnerability if we're going to try to move through the situation. And I know that some of you might be sitting here going, well, geez, if the person's spending over the budget, why am I the one that has to facilitate the conversation? Because if you learn how to facilitate these conversations, your life is going to be easier long term. Okay? I can't tell you enough how important it is to just learn how to spearhead the tough conversations in your life. Because if you feel really comfortable in doing it, then you can get all kinds of crazy situations thrown at you that are like, I can't believe this is life. And you'll feel like you trust yourself enough to be competent to navigate them. And once you're in that space, you feel like you have more control over your life. So you're doing this for you. If the person keeps spending over the budget, you can walk away, but you're doing this for you. So number one, let's isolate the problem. Number two, let's get to the roots. Let's bring vulnerability into the conversation, create a space where we can say non-judgmentally, hey, I really want to understand why this keeps happening. Like, one question I ask people in my life, sorry, my computer's making all these noises. One question I ask people in my life is, hey, what's going on inside of you that leads to this outcome? Like, I really want to understand so we can work through this together. And so this is if it's a budget. This is if it's somebody that does something that's not healthy. Hey, let's talk about what the root cause is here. And vulnerability brings issues to the surface, which further turns them into solvable problems, right? So you can ask things like, what are you feeling that is creating these actions or these scenarios? One thing that's really important about this is that for ourselves, this also depersonalizes things. Like, if we don't ask that question, we might be really good at understanding that, there's deeper root issues at an intellectual level, but maybe after 6 months of somebody doing something, if we're not having the conversations or trying to solve the problem, it doesn't really matter if we intellectually know there's a deeper root cause. We're going to start giving it meaning eventually that's like, the person doesn't care about me. They don't care about the budget. They don't care about our household. I'm not cared about. I'm unloved. I'm all alone, etc. Right? We can easily go down that rabbit hole. So this is making sense so far? Okay, good. I'm glad. Okay, so I'm gonna, I love that question. How do you isolate cheating? I'll show you in just a moment. I'll give you an example about that specifically, and we'll break it down. It's probably a better example, actually. I was trying to pick one that wasn't so heavy, but I'll do both because, everybody's gone through cheating. I should pick the one that's most legitimate for people's situations. So I'm like, I always talk about these heavy topics, but it probably makes the most sense to do it that way. So the next thing is, by understanding is one of the only things that will substitute for inner conflict and turmoil. Why? Because the brain loves to fill in the blanks. So if I'm like, the person spent over the budget or the person cheated, if I don't understand why from their perspective and what they were going through, my brain's going to be like, because I'm not good enough, I'm not cared about, I'm unloved, or whatever core wounds the individual has playing, right? Unless you've done a lot of work on your core wounds and then maybe you navigate it more easily. But in really emotionally charged situations, it's not just not having the core wounds, it's also not being imprinted by the situation with new core wounds or new painful experiences. So we really want to master that step. What are you feeling that's creating these actions? What's going on beneath the surface that led to this? I really want to understand. Is there anything we can do together? Is there anything you need from me? Open the dialogue, okay? The next thing, validate each other's feelings. You want to rebuild trust? Both parties' emotions need to be validated. I know this is like the most challenging friggin' thing in the world, especially if you're like the person that was cheated on. And to be honest, I have a pretty strong boundary in my life about being cheated on. Like I'm pretty sure that in most situations that could ever occur, if there's cheating, that for me, it's like a non-negotiable. But there are a lot of people, and my boundary is not everybody's boundary, right? And I'm not saying that that's the best boundary either. And I'm not saying that that would be the boundary I would always uphold. That's what I imagine, but I'm open to seeing what could possibly happen. Maybe you have 2 young kids, or, a family, or a mortgage, or all these different things. Or maybe you just really love the person, and the person just went through a really tough year, and you're like, geez, I can see why that happened. So, it's really like, let's look through it, right? And so let's say that's the example. And I've helped couples, by the way, for a very long time in, I won't say hundreds, but many, many situations, tens of situations, work through cheating and infidelity in relationships, in marriages. And it's so hard for the party who is cheated on, but you have to validate the person's feelings and understand where they're coming from when they do express. And the things that I'll hear about people who cheat are things like, I was feeling alone. I was feeling isolated. I was feeling rejected. A lot of them have a lot of core wounds that are really activated first. I was feeling that you didn't love me anymore. I see a lot of partners cheating, honestly, long-term in relationship dynamics when there's been an incessant dynamic that hasn't been recognized or worked on around attachment trauma. Like a lot of times when there's a dismissive avoidant and an anxious preoccupied, the anxious cheats after 10, 15 years. They're not necessarily super likely to cheat soon on, but if they stayed in the power struggle stage, how long can a human being go on thinking, I'm unloved, I'm not cared about, my partner isn't interested in me, all those different things, when they have such high needs for connection and all these different things? Those are like creating the breeding grounds for these types of scenarios to take place. And so until one party can see that in the other party, until, let's say in this specific example, the dismissive avoidant can be like, wow, I see that you felt unloved. I see that I'm not validating your behavior. I'm not validating the way you responded to that. I'm not making that okay. But I can see how you felt all those painful feelings that then led to you making the justifications that you did. I can see how it happens, and I'm sorry that you felt alone and unloved. That was not the case. Until that part is done, and obviously like big time, the cheater has to first go and like validate the person who was hurt and cheating. But this is like rebuilding that connection of both parties being seen, taken into consideration and heard, which then create the next steps for moving effectively through the problem. I love that, Jermaine. Look at Jermaine's comment. That's why I hold the art of understanding so high. I respond so much when a person makes me understand their why. It's beautiful. And it's true, right? It helps us to feel like we're validating one another and can see and understand each other. So I'm just going to go through a couple comments here, and then I'm going to go through the next steps, okay? And I'll make it the 2 things, the spending over budget and the cheating. I'll put them together. So Tony says this is, Rachel says, I had a phone call with an old friend. She was lately gossiping about another friend of hers, and I felt my trust meter significantly drop and had to have a powwow with my internal monologue after. Good for you. Tony says this has happened to me with my friendships too, where I or we couldn't repair the friendship, even though we seem to be working on it, but not really. So not having the full conversation about it, right? And like how it's really impacting you and making you feel. I feel like this should be easier with family than friends for some reason, at least to isolate the trust issue. Very interesting. Sometimes it's easier with family than friends because we feel more around relationships that have more history. So we notice the feelings more, and it's easier to get clearer on like what we're feeling because there's more emotional charge around it, because there's, those things and feelings have been there longer, sort of collecting or building up. But of course it can, and sometimes we have different expectations for family than for friends. That's another really sort of key point as to why I can feel different. I like that you raised that point. So we've isolated the problem. We've tried to understand the root cause of the problem. okay? We've opened dialogue to have a vulnerable conversation. We've validated each other's needs or emotions in the situation, okay? Acknowledge the pain on both ends, as hard as that can be. And we've talked about, like, again, those really big root causes. Then both parties have to agree, and this is like a thing that I've historically made couples go through when I do work with couples. I'm like, are you open to working on it for a certain period of time? And you create a time boundary. And I know you guys have heard me talk a lot about this in terms of breakups, like time boundaries with breakups, where it's like, if somebody breaks up in a situation, or maybe you haven't even broken up, but a relationship is just not working, and you're like, okay, I think I might want to break up. One of the best things you're going to do before you fully walk away, and trust me on this because I've seen many, many healing journeys go through this. One of the best things you're going to do is you're going to first set a boundary in your head for how long you're willing to put in the work. And you might, before you reach that boundary, be like, okay, I'm done. But you have to put everything you can in first, because even though it's going to be a pain in the butt for that 4 weeks, that 6 weeks, that 3 months, that 6 months for some people, if you don't, usually the regret and the wondering lingers a lot longer and makes the breakup keep hurting more long term. And so it's really important for both parties in whatever situation. Obviously, like if you've been dating somebody for 3 months and they cheat, and they've cheated a bunch of, these sorts of things, you just know sometimes like that's not worth putting energy in, you're clear. But in the times where there's more misunderstanding, or that's not a very strong boundary for you in your personal programming or your needs, then it's a different scenario. So both parties have to commit to working towards resolution. And you want to understand, like, okay, what are the steps we can take collectively to work through this? What support do we need? Because here's the thing. I'm not at all like victim blaming the person who was cheated on, let's say, for example, or the person whose money was spent when the other person went over budget. But there's usually something in the dynamic of the relationship that both parties are involved in that creates one person's poor decision to violate the trust in a relationship in the first place. So it's not that that person is at fault in any way, but it is that that person has the power to change the dynamic, which affects the root causes of why the issue took place. So for example, let's use that example again of the dismissive and the anxious, okay? And let's say, and this is a common dynamic I see when a marital partner cheats on their spouse, let's say the anxious person has felt unloved for a very long time. And let's say it's because one of their love languages is physical affection, and the dismissive avoidant was like, that's not my thing, I'm not working on it. I show up in other areas, refuse to go there. And I've seen this in many cases, this exact specific dynamic many, many times. And so, it's not the dismissive avoidance fault that they got cheated on. That was that person that made the decision, and that's how they responded to the frustration they were feeling. And it's up to this person to keep communicating their needs, right? But this person needs to participate in some form to help co-create the change in that situation. And so maybe the person's like, I can't even go near you because this just happened. But maybe, it's a goal to just be more affectionate in one area, or to say, I can see myself giving affection long term. Maybe it's to start with giving like a peck on the cheek, or a hug, or holding a hand while you sit down to watch TV if you're a married couple in the evening, or whatever it is, right? There has to be some kind of co-creative work towards resolution for things to change. And it's a hard thing to own. So, when you make the commitment to work on it, it's like you got to take everything into consideration. Both parties are going to go through a tough time when it comes to rebuilding trust in big areas. So you want to ask each other, okay, what do you need to collectively work through this? So what does the person who did the crappy thing need? And maybe they need support outside of the relationship. Maybe they went and drank $1,000 away this month because they have a drinking issue. And maybe what they need is to go to a rehab facility. And then you need to be like, okay, is this something I am okay with working on? Or is this a non-negotiable for me? And you have to get really clear on what your boundaries are. And we're going to go to boundaries in a little bit. So you want to be really clear there. And then most importantly, if you're the person whose trust was violated, you need to take the time and you need to write out every single thing that you need as a person. Okay. And you need to get really clear, and you need to go to that person that did the violating, and you need to say, listen, I can see that these are your needs. These are mine in order to move through this. Are you willing to step up to the plate and try to meet these? And sit with those things. Question your expectations. Sometimes there can be a little bit of overreactivity to something like cheating, for example, where, it's not uncommon for me to see that, let's say it's a male that cheats on a female, and the male has historically gotten along very well and had friendships that were both men and women. It's not uncommon for the female to say something like, do not have a female friend ever again. And maybe that's the right thing, but sit with those things because, is this a fair expectation? Is this something that's going to hold up long term in the marriage? Is this the standard I'm going to hold the situation to? Is that going to work for that person? Is that person going to be able to meet the needs? So really sit with those things, write them all out, feel whatever comes out first, and then try to sit there honestly and go, okay, are these fair expectations? Most of them you'll see are, and then some might be like a little bit emotionally charged. Just sit with them for a moment and really consider, and then go present them. Okay. And you want to put this in the context of defining what you need. And you can say, these are the things I need in order to proceed through this. And then the next part is you can't just communicate the need. It's also strategizing on behalf of the needs. And so you have to be able to sit with the person and be able to say, hey, this is what I need. What are some strategies we can come up with? This is what you need. How can I meet this? If we don't have the clarity for the needs, we're just going to go back down a not so great rabbit hole again, right? We're just going to go back into the cycle of being like, the person didn't meet my needs. They don't care about me. Because oftentimes people show up to meet a need, they attempt to meet a need, but they're unclear, or they meet it in a way that they think that you want it, not how you truly want it. So there needs to be a lot of clarity brought to the discussion. It is so common for me. Good night, Kelly. First checking my core wounds. Beautiful. Good night. So first, it's so important to be really, really clear about everything that's going on, right? So if it just, I'll use this analogy. I'm sure you guys know it, but it's just a really important one. So I'm going to push this message a lot too. So it's repetitively in everybody's brains and it's part of your internal way of perceiving the world. But, somebody might be like, I want more affection. And the dismissive avoidant might be like, oh, they want more affectionate comments. So I will say things more, or I'll do more affectionate acts of service. And the anxious or fearful avoidant might be like, the person never holds my hand. I wanted physical affection. So if we're not clear enough, we're just going to go right back into the same cycles. Okay. And then the next pieces are break these things down into feasible steps. So if it's, I need more affection, let's do an affectionate activity on Wednesdays, or let's try to hug each other before bed, or let's try to, let's get really clear and specific and let's put it into a pattern in our lives. So it's integrated, so we can repeat it. So it becomes a new normal for the context of our relationship. And it's in doing these things that like a lot of beautiful things can flourish out of them. And then the next piece is actively take steps to check in on your progress. So put a habit together, every week. Hey, how did we do? Have all those needs written down. Are we doing okay in this area? And the people that I've seen I've seen some pretty intense betrayals in relationships with money, with trust in terms of cheating, infidelity, with gambling, with addiction, lots of big things. If I see two parties who are both motivated, they care to try to put in the work, but with boundaries, not like we're going to do this forever, even if the relationship sucks and is painful. It's not like a codependent thing. It's like we're going to work really hard for the 3 months or for the 6 months. If both parties are motivated, if both parties go through these steps, and if both parties truly check in and work on having the conscious conversations and working through these steps together, people get through these things. I would say it's rare that they don't, as long as they have those key ingredients, okay? Because you're addressing everything and you're becoming closer because of it. You're really deeply understanding. You're peeling back all these layers. You're not trying to work at the symptom level. You're working at the roots, and you're having all these really tough and challenging conversations, but in a beautiful way, okay? And so that active check-in looks like, hey, how are we doing with our habits? Did you feel like your needs were met this week? Did I feel like my needs were met? Hold space for each other to communicate, like, hey, and try to communicate in an uplifting way. Like, hey, this and this was really great. This could use some more work. So don't just be like, oh, you didn't do that one thing on the list. Don't just go for the negatives first, which is tempting to do because the mind holds on and notices negative more than positive. But look for those specific characteristics or qualities, right? Like what's going on here, what was good, and let's highlight that so we can see that there is progress, and then let's work on the bad. And I would say the one other thing in here is that it's also important to recognize, I think I mentioned this somewhat just briefly in a recent webinar, but it's also important for you to recognize the change in the other person and validate it, because I see a lot of people, I've seen situations, for example, where like, let's say one party's working on sobriety, and it's a really tough thing to go through as a spouse of somebody, or even as a family member of somebody. Like all these different things can be really tough. And sometimes I've seen, and it's like a little bit heart-wrenching to see, but it's well-meaning, it's human experience. But sometimes I've seen, for example, like one person's really working on sobriety and they've been sober for a year and they've just been like doing so well and working so hard and turning their life around. And maybe they've been struggling for 30 years with something, 40 years with something, and then they trip up once. And that's not uncommon in the first year of sobriety for somebody to trip up and then kind of go back to sobriety again, and then maybe trip up one or two more times and then like stay on the path permanently, if they have the right tools, for example. But because sometimes people just target the conscious mind, and then it's really tough to transform things. But if that happens, we can't look at the person in those situations. If the person spends the money again, and that's why if you're the person on the other side of this, have to be so clear about our boundaries out of the gates, because we might say, if it's cheating, and if you ever cheat again, that's not okay at all. It happened once, I'm willing to work on it once. But maybe with something like sobriety or somebody overspending, you might go, this is absolutely unacceptable, but you don't define a never again sort of boundary, because you realize maybe they'll trip up once, but as long as they're taking massive strides on the path to sobriety or to not spending, or, then I'm willing to hold space. And sometimes I see that somebody's working really hard, and then the person makes a mistake once and they go, see, you're always that person, you're this, you're that. And we label each other as these old stories of ourselves, despite that one or both parties are making a ton of progressive change. And so we have to also balance that sort of dynamic of being able to make that progressive change in the process. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. You guys are so sweet. You've got your spreadsheets. That's amazing. I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah, and remember, these are all recorded, so you can always go back, and like any points that you need to go back on and refresh through are really great. And these are great steps for you to just know in your life, to be quite honest. Like, I don't want to be like gloom and doomy in any way, but it's so common that at some point in our life, somebody meaningful to us is going to breach our trust. And, I think, I don't want to be so dramatic. I keep thinking of all these dramatic words, but I think one of the tragedies of life is when we really deeply love somebody, a family member, a friend, a partner, and we care so much, but then we have these like wounds that are, as some of the things that are so fundamental to relationships are like trust and honesty and connection and clarity. And like, there's certain things that are just, communication, that are like the foundational parts of a relationship. And when that's violated or when that's messed up, sometimes without that, it's just really, really tough, right? Like, it's like we can love and care about somebody so much, but without that really foundational part in place in a relationship, it can be, we only ever get to connect, the relationship changes, right? And we only can connect so much to the person in a specific way, because we have to keep such extreme boundaries in order to protect ourselves from somebody, because we haven't fixed the trust. And so, in that case, most people will have some sort of experience of this in their life. Maybe not, because you guys are learning the tools now and hopefully have a chance, but maybe a lot of you have already been through an experience like this. I wouldn't be surprised. And so I would keep these things, and I would get really clear about them and keep them, sort of stored away, so that you have the option and the empowerment at any point in your life, if there's somebody you deeply care about, to try these things out and to work through these things. Or if you ever make a mistake and you violate somebody's trust, then you have the option to be like, okay, if you want to work on it, I know how, I know. And one of the most beautiful things I will say is that It's not a beautiful experience to be cheated on, or to have somebody spend all the money, or to, learn that a partner or a spouse or a child or a parent has a gambling addiction or alcoholism. I've seen a lot of these things firsthand in the work that I do with people. And that's not beautiful. It's hard and it's tragic, and sometimes it's really heartbreaking. But I can't think of, I'm being so dramatic today for some reason, but I can't think of times that I had to sit in sessions and hold back tears less than times when people were doing this work together. Like, it is like, wow, like the level of depth and like honesty and vulnerability and rawness people are forced to bring to the table to have to work through these issues, and how that impacts a relationship long term and how that changes the trajectory of a relationship is honestly one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. And those are the sessions where I'm like, I've done historically, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I have to try to, not cry or, unravel just watching these things, because they're so heartwarming and beautiful to watch people like dig deep and have to do this type of work that's, the real unconditionally loving stuff. So it's beautiful work to do. And I think it kind of changes like the person doing the work to a certain degree in a really powerful way. So there's a lot of, even though it's so painful to go through that, it can be beautiful to have that experience and come out of it. So with that being said, let's talk about boundaries for a few minutes. As I went on this like sort of spiel about about human beings. Okay, let me answer a couple questions in here, and then we'll talk about boundaries, and I'll take you guys through a little boundary work process. It's like the step-by-step of things. I'll you guys have some really great questions I can see already. Okay, so Tony says, I think you had a question about the process, but I think you guys got it. Awesome. So Tony says, I wasn't willing to follow through on these, so I had to walk away. His wasn't cheating. It was emotional unavailability. So this is affirming how I handled it. He wanted this kind of communication to just happen without work. Said it seemed too artificial to him. So that's beautiful. Like I remember this process for you, Tony, a little bit, and seeing some of the things you were sharing in the webinars, and I could see like you were showing up, doing the work, and you kind of went through this process. Like you were able to do the work, try different things, change the approach, pivot, and you did it for a sustained period of time. And then you get your answer, and it's like, okay, I'm ready to be able to move on because I know that I'm trying, and the person's not able to reciprocate or is not willing. And then you have clarity about your answer. And I find that the people who struggle the most with breakups historically are the people who didn't have the clarity. And sometimes I've worked with people in the past, and I know they're frustrated at me a little bit. Like, why am I like, I don't want to like have to do these different things, but sometimes they show up and then they're like, I'm sick of it. And I can tell that they're like, I'm done now. But I'm like, okay, this is good for your healing. Like now you're ready to truly move on. And the people who tend to stay stuck on breakups the longest are the people who specifically, just walk away early or emotionally or prematurely and didn't try to put the effort in first. So it's a really good tool to remember if you're thinking about breaking up or ending a relationship. Obviously, if it's like something abusive or extremely unhealthy, you need to leave immediately, point blank, period. But if it's like the person being closed off, or if it's the person, X, Y, and Z, give yourself a time boundary. Do the work during that time. You're only going to learn because of it and grow because of it. And then you'll also get true closure when you choose to walk away, which is so important for healing from a breakup. So great shares in there. And I'm happy you went through that process, Tony, and I hope you're doing well, and feeling good. So Rachel says, would you change anything with this system for a relationship like FA, repairing trust with a parent, where there were a lot of micro traumas over years and years, and the parent internalizes or blames themselves whenever there's a conversation about the past? AKA, I can't imagine doing this set of exercises with my mom. What I would do, and I hear you so much. I know exactly what you're saying. You are saying that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm filling in a bunch of gaps here, but you were saying that there were a bunch of micro traumas over the years with a parent. And if you try to bring up the past, the parent kind of goes into victim mode a little bit and blames themselves. And then what happens? Then you feel like you're the bad guy. You feel like, oh my gosh, I'm being bad. They're just blaming themselves and guilting themselves. And the problem is that then you feel guilty and then you want to get away from the situation because it doesn't feel good. It seems like they're taking ownership, but you're not getting the proper healing that you needed because you didn't get the opportunity to properly talk through and work through the situation, which is actually what you needed in this process. And so it's easy to just sort of jump away from the situation instead. And then you're like, I feel stuck. So I think that is probably what you are saying. And so what, if this is you, okay, any of you guys, I know this is what Rachel is sharing, but if this is you and this is your experience, take those steps and think of this as like a little puzzle you're putting together. Write all those steps out and then pick like 1 or 2 things and little approaches you can try all the time. And maybe start by prefacing the first place I would go to. And I've actually done this work in specific situations with parents, but, start by saying, hey, I really want to have a conversation with you about some things that happened in the past because it's so important for my healing and my heart or for my ability to move on. I want to be able to sit down. I want to talk through things in a specific manner. I notice that sometimes I run into a situation where I try to talk about things and then I know you feel so badly. And then I feel guilty that you're feeling badly. And then I feel like we don't get to resolution. And there are specific things I need for resolution and try to define those things. So say things like from the steps, like, for example, I really need you to understand what I need from the situation in order to move forward. And I also want to understand what was happening. This is one of the most powerful questions any human being is going to ever ask their parents is, what was happening inside of you that led to these different things? What was going on in your life that created that output? And when you can have those conversations, it's really, really beautiful. I've had these myself. I've worked with people one-on-one who have had these conversations. I've heard stories from people in the school that have been having these conversations and sent them via email, not like in this context through these steps per se, but like, I ended up asking these things. I did the conflict resolution course and these things, and there's some really beautiful stories. So, break it down, tell the person ahead of time the things that you need. So maybe you pick like 1 or 2 steps you just want to try first and, progress you want to make, because maybe it wasn't a one-time, isolated situation, like somebody cheated or somebody spent all the money. Maybe it was like Rachel was mentioning, all these little micro traumas that happened over and over again. I like that word, by the way. Definitely going to be using that word. Micro trauma is such a great word. Wow. And so if you can sort of put everything there in front of you and have pick 1 or 2 approaches and be really clear ahead of time. And then if you can sort of pioneer the conversation and tweak your approach and say like, hey, I don't want you to feel badly. Like every parent goes through different things, and being a parent is obviously not easy. It's its own challenge in life to go through these things. But here's specifically what I'm needing. Sometimes I think it's very useful for parents who are like, can be alarmed by their kids bringing up some of these things from the past. I think it can be really useful for them to have clarity and direction on about what you need, because I think parents really, really love their kids and just value them and care so much and want to do the best. But I think it can make them like very emotional when these things come up, like, oh my gosh, the worst thing I would want to feel like is that I was a bad parent or that I didn't do enough. And I think it can trigger so much emotional chaos that it can be really helpful if they're the recipient to hear like the very clear direction about what you're needing. So preface it, give the intentions ahead of time, pioneer the conversation, say like, hey, I want to work on our needs. I want to understand. This would really help me, these sorts of things. And the more you keep the tone like honest and open and authentic, and maybe you're going to have to try a different approach a few times. And maybe it's going to go really well one time and the next time it's not going to go as well. And maybe you have to break it down into scenarios. But I would write all those steps out, think about which one of those steps is most beneficial for you in the part of the relationship you're at now. If you can do them chronologically, that's always going to be the best. But if you're like, okay, this person isn't going to feel comfortable sharing their feelings around it and for us to validate each other's feelings, so maybe I'll just go directly to the understanding part. Pick those things and make those decisions accordingly and play with it. Just use it as a process to keep learning and growing and unfolding, and that's going to be very beneficial. So great questions, you guys. Good night, Rose. That's so interesting. I was actually thinking about that when she was talking about the check-ins, wondering how to get over that idea of it being overly planned out or not organic enough. Oh, so I must have missed a question. It sounds like a great question. Oh no, I think that was just a conversation. Okay. So Mateo says, I did this with my stepdad when I was 19, and I can attest it changes everything. Over 25 years later, we are still close because of it. That's so beautiful. And it really is, it's a game changer. And I think it's such a gift to have, change things around in terms of our relationship dynamics. And it's also a game changer to be able to practice these tools and apply them to hard things in your life, because once you do it once or twice and it really works, like you see the results, you start feeling empowered to move through relationship dynamics like this and do whatever you need to do in these situations. And that's a beautiful thing. So I'm going to answer a couple more questions, and I'm going to go through a quick little boundary process for you guys. I'm happy to hear that, Tony. So I'm going to go through a quick little boundary process with you guys, and we can expand on this in the future webinars to come as well. So let me see. So the next question is, Jermaine says, Thais, my relationship with my mother is my biggest challenge. I didn't have a great childhood with her, and of course, it's created my FA attachment style and other problems. Even though she fell short as a parent, I know she did the best she could, and I forgave her. But till this day, I'm still highly triggered by her and usually find myself very angry and disappointed in her presence. It seems from what you have said that the problem is trust. Yes. Okay. The problem is trust. And the problem is that as well, and just to be really to the point, if you still feel highly triggered by somebody often, which is like the most common thing, sometimes I think I remember being like, I'll never not feel triggered by certain things with my mom, or, and if that's happening, there's still things you have to forgive. And, there's so much to say about this topic, but forgiveness requires like a deep understanding. And there might just be like, it's the specific things that she still triggers you about that are the things that there still needs to be forgiveness work around. And you can also just set a boundary there and be like, okay, these things are not acceptable, but chances are you need to be able to say maybe more about, I'll rattle off some things that can be happening in this situation and see what sort of resonates with you. So number one, you might have forgiven her like overall about childhood, but there might be specific things she still does that still are hurting you and still reminding you of these past imprints. And so it's like you're being re-triggered over and over again, and you have to set a boundary there or communicate that you need her to shift that pattern of behavior that she's doing. It could be that you haven't forgiven yourself for things that you took away from that experience. This is also quite common when we're stuck. So like, let's say, for example, Bob. Haven't talked about Bob at all tonight. So let's say Bob had his mother be super critical all the time. And maybe Bob felt like he wasn't good enough as a result. And then maybe Bob brought that into other areas of his life, like his relationships. And maybe Bob was like, okay, so I'm not good enough to be with my ideal partner. And so he like pre-sold himself short of that. So he like didn't give himself permission to really pursue the women he wanted in his life or the men he wanted in his life if Bob is homosexual, or whatever the case is, right? So like if there are these situations where Bob is like making himself not good enough because of these things, he's taken these things on and they're imprinted, then Bob can be in a situation where he might have forgiven his mother, but he didn't forgive himself about what he did to himself, not obviously on purpose, and it's not even his fault, it's his circumstances, right? But then it's his responsibility to change. So he might have not forgiven himself for those things. And so his mother still triggers those things because they're still alive in him. So that can be another thing that can happen. Or if there's people that we have in our lives that still deeply trigger us, it can be that they're our shadow. It can be that we didn't have the full understanding of those specific circumstances. So we forgave mom overall, but we didn't talk about this one thing that she keeps doing. Maybe we forgave mom for, let's say in Bob's case, being so critical, but maybe Bob is violating our boundary, or Bob's mom is violating his boundaries now. And that's a new problem. And we didn't get to work on that piece and really have a conversation about that. And so sometimes we can have this like high level forgiveness, which is very helpful. But sometimes if we're still getting all these triggers, we have to go into like the deeper layers of this. And this, you can use these same sort of steps. It's like, some of these big pieces about understanding the why, validating each other's feelings, committing to making change in the relationship. Like some of these overall themes will still apply. So I would advise the same thing, like go through the steps, see what sticks out for you and really resonates, and bring that into the relationship. And your mom is going to be the best place to work on things. Like our parents are our greatest teachers if we allow them to be. And I think sometimes we have these really beautiful opportunities to work through different things in our lives as people, and that our parents sort of hold these golden nuggets for us, right? Because it's got to be really, really tough to be a parent, but it's really tough to go through the trauma of being conditioned in childhood. So we've got both really unique sides to it. Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, this is beautiful. You guys are sharing some really powerful things. So Annette says, this may be a strange question, but what if you don't trust someone else to know themselves well enough to communicate what they need? With my ADHD AAX being rather disconnected from his emotions at times, I often felt like I couldn't trust his judgment. Not sure if that's me just exhibiting as a distrustful FA trait. It's a great question. This is like another one of those questions where I'm like, you're like really integrating the work because you're able to see like, oh, is it the FA or is it this experience? Like these are wonderful questions. So the answer is try, let's say you're backtracking to that situation. I would just try to move through that again. So I would try to be like, okay, this person's disconnected from their emotions. What are different approaches? Like, let's say you're back in that situation. What are the different approaches? How can I communicate more specifically what I need? How can I communicate that I need his judgment to be more clear? I need him to try to go inside of himself for longer, ask deeper questions. And if I try a few of those things and I don't see progress, then I have my answer really, really clearly at the end. And that's a beautiful, powerful thing. So it's sort of like that same idea, like go for it. You're only ever going to learn and practice fine-tuning your communication. And if things don't work, then you can move away in a different direction. Let's see here. So Mateo says, is there ever a situation where we wouldn't do this with a parent, such as they are an alcoholic? This is a great question. Yes. I think I was mentioning really briefly earlier, like if there's somebody who's really unhealthy, or abusive or anything like that, absolutely walk away. With alcoholism, it's so tough. Like if they're a current alcoholic or they're a current addict or gambling, whatever it is in any form, if there's like a toxicity element there, you have to get really clear with your boundaries first. That's the step that you want to focus on the most. And you want to define like, what is my relationship going to be like? And what you might find is that you're like, maybe you're hopeful and you can't leave that stone unturned. And you're like, let me try to have a conversation and get the person to validate my feelings and just see or understand. And sometimes there are tremendous breakthroughs with people that I've seen firsthand with a parent who is an alcoholic or with a parent who is, I've seen all kinds of things. Really challenging dynamics and situations. And sometimes there are tremendous breakthroughs, but not all of the steps work. Like sometimes it'll be like 5 steps forward, but you were hoping for the full 10. And in that case, it's this trial and error space, as long as this person isn't going to put you in any sort of, harm. So it's like, can we have a deeper conversation? Can I try to initiate? Can I try different approaches? But if you just see that this is a little bit crazy, this is too much, then you have to be able to make sure that you have those hard boundaries set for yourself. So just a little like step you could use for these more sort of scary, I don't want to say scary, but like more challenging situations is to be really clear ahead of time about your boundaries. And you can do sort of like a if this, then this type of scenario. This is what I've historically gone through with clients. Like if somebody's still currently a very, very intense alcoholic, and I've seen this, then you can say like, listen, this is what I want to work on. This is not just like alcohol abuse or somebody made this huge mistake or they're struggling. It's like they're drinking all day, every day. They can't be present. You can try to have these conversations about the needs, about these different things, get to the bottom of it. Maybe the person needs to go to rehab first before you can really do this work. Maybe there are more significant things that need to happen that require some external force or support. But try these things and see what the responses are. So in the very least, you know for certain that you're moving in the right direction when you choose to move away. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Great question, by the way. Excellent question. So Jamie says, a lot of my healing has happened after my mom passed. At times it is required neutral storytelling based on what I know about her past. It can be a bit of detective work, memories, stories from other family members. What else do you recommend for forgiveness or healing when someone can't be contacted? That's a beautiful question as well. Other things besides shadow work. So I would say basically the things that you're doing would honestly be my answer. It would be the things that you're doing, like the trying to understand, trying to put yourself in her position, empathizing, considering what you know about her past, her history, so you can get some of that understanding piece there. But then the biggest pieces that should be your number one focus are, what are the imprints that left in me that I carried along with me? And it's sort of a strange thing, but I find when people do like really deep work, some sort of like clearing work that you guys will start to learn about in the breakup course this next month, like getting over a breakup, it's like this really deep tool that I sort of use around trauma clearing and things we really need to deeply emotionally process. And what we can talk about is, one of the biggest pain points that we take from these sorts of situations is, I made myself the way that this person made me feel. So for example, like let's say Bob again, let's just use the criticism part just to give a simple analogy. I have all these stories that come to mind of people who I've had these experiences with and worked with in the past. But let's just say Bob in the example of criticism again, and Bob's being criticized, and that made him make himself small. Usually the biggest pieces of forgiveness we ever have are how we treated ourselves for prolonged periods of time as a result of having had those experiences. And honestly, those are the things we have to let go of the most. And so I would really focus in on, Jamie, the things about, how did my mom make me feel on those imprints? What imprints did I get? Did I get feeling alone or not good enough or abandoned? And how many times did I make myself feel alone? How many times did I make myself feel abandoned? How many times? And forgiving yourself and understanding why you put yourself in that position and setting yourself free and rebuilding that trust in the relationship to yourself. So kind of turning that entire dynamic inward is really powerful to do. And that's one of the best things I think we can do if we have a parent that's no longer here, or if we're working on forgiving and moving through a breakup where we don't talk to the person anymore, they're not available, these sorts of things. Great question. You guys are asking like such insightful questions. It's so amazing. Jermaine says, I may be Bob, and I think a little of everything you mentioned as well. Interesting. So, I'm glad to hear that was helpful. Just those sorts of points, right? Of the criticism, and then we make ourselves small and not worthy or not good. And then it's that person, every time they come back, mom comes into the room, mom calls us on the phone, it reignites those subconsciously stored imprints that are in ourselves. And so mom is still your teacher. Until the triggers are gone, that person is still your teacher. I know that sounds like it can be taken the wrong way, but it's a really beautiful perspective that ends up transforming the way we perceive those things in the first place, which make them more manageable and more solvable to work through. So, awesome, Jamie. I'm so happy to hear. And Mateo, wonderful. Wow. Yeah. So your mother was an alcoholic. She stopped drinking 10 years ago. Thank God. I've seen a lot of situations where an individual comes from the home of an alcoholic. It's really, really tough. But sometimes I don't know. I don't want to get into like spiritual things, but I sometimes think that God doesn't put things in our path that we aren't meant to be able to work through and empower ourselves further because of. And so anything that's there that's still a trigger, or just, from a human evolution standpoint, right? Those things are there. You're noticing them. You guys have already, I've seen you, Jermaine, since the beginning of joining the school, and you've done such great work here. And some of the insights and shares you've had around shadow work or different things are so powerful. You for sure will be able to move through this if you just make a commitment to working through every trigger that pops up with her and using the relationship as an ability for her to be your teacher and move through things. And, relationships become so beautiful when we choose that path instead. So is it true that people are over apologetic who are over criticized as children? I would definitely say there's a huge relationship there. It's not always the sole reason, but definitely a strong relationship there. It's another really wonderful question. just like pattern recognition, right? Pema Chodron, I'm not sure who that is, but I will look them up. It sounds really interesting. Has a great quote that anyone, even the people who make us crazy, I would say mostly those people, can be your teacher. I love that. I absolutely agree. I think one of the most empowering perceptions we can adopt as people is every painful thing that happens outside of us that triggers something inside of us is showing us to ourselves. Like it's showing, us what's inside of us that are still our emotions or our patterns or our imprints that need healing, need loving, need recognition, maybe need just a boundary. But, all these things are really showing us to ourselves. And if we see the world through that lens, it's really hard to like get stuck in the storytelling as much. It's instead like, ooh, what is in here for me? How can I learn or grow or adapt? And we won't always be able to do that. There will be times where somebody dies or, these different things happen and we have to go through like just a full grieving process and do some deeper work around it and allow ourselves room to just feel and be in pain sometimes. But for a lot of those day-to-day things, we can just empower ourselves ahead of time to not even have to suffer. Maybe we can feel the pain of unmet needs, but not even have to suffer because we choose to look at how this is showing us something that's positive for us instead of like, oh, this is this, terrible, painful thing that's just negative, right? So I'm going to go through a really quick overview of a boundary work process here. And then I'm going to dive into some steps because then I'm going to let you guys run and go to sleep soon because I know that it's a little bit late. So, and thank you guys for always like sticking in here and learning and doing all this stuff with me and asking all these really insightful questions, even when we're like, I'm like, oh, hour-long webinars. And then all this time passes so quickly. So boundary expression. Okay. Let's talk about steps for a moment. So I'm going to give you a really high level overview. Step 1, identify the feeling. When a boundary is violated, the first thing we want to do, and I'm going to do a really high level overview today, and then you'll see in the webinar schedule, there's a lot to do with boundaries next month. So we'll dive into like deepening this overview as in the next few weeks with more and more details, sort of like we did with trust today. Number 1, identify the feeling. Number 2, identify why this hurts. Do you hear what I'm saying in there too? I'm like, use the feeling as feedback, then isolate the problem, right? Because once you isolate the problem becomes a solvable problem. And like first step to any major transformation in your emotional healing. Number 3, identify what you needed to happen instead. Okay, I've just like really simplified the boundary process because I think sometimes people are like, what the heck's a boundary? It's your feelings and needs. What does that mean? So identify what you needed or wanted to happen instead. Number 4, check in with that and make sure that that's the right thing, because sometimes we're like, I needed the person to just, maybe you're like a student and you're going back to school and maybe you're like, I just needed the professor to give me 100%. And maybe, so check in with that because sometimes our emotions can be a little bit misleading. So be really honest with yourself. And then number 5, find an effective way to express it. And this is a way of just like really simplifying and breaking down the boundary process. Now, what I was going to do next is like really pluck apart each step so you could see like, how can I identify the feeling better in real time? How can I isolate the problem a little bit more effectively? And what are some tools and strategies in there? How can I identify what I needed instead? And I can give you some reference points and things like that. But I don't want to rush it because it's powerful work. And I know boundaries are such a big thing for you guys. And you guys have asked so many amazing questions around boundaries and wanted more content. So I'm going to save all of this other stuff and really plucking apart those steps for the next webinars to come. So you have the chance to really go through these things and ask a whole bunch of questions with them. So with that being said, it's 2 a.m. in the UK. Thank you for being here, Halima. That's so wonderful. Thank you for being here. My spreadsheet is popping. That's amazing. Requesting again as I had to go. Can we start with a subject posted and end with a question submitted earlier? Yes. Oh, yes. I forgot to do that. I'm so sorry. Great call, actually. Do the questions at the end. Thank you for reminding me. How am I going to remember that when I start the next webinar? I'm going to write it in my schedule on the day of the actual webinar. Okay. Thank you. That's actually such a valuable piece of feedback, honestly, because like, hello, you guys are here live. Okay. I'm just trying to find the next date of the webinar. So webinar schedule will be out tomorrow. It's just basically exactly what the webinar times currently have been. We're keeping the times the same for everybody. And then you'll have all the content so you can see ahead of time what webinars you want to attend. My advice for you guys is like mark the webinars in your calendar when you see them tomorrow for the ones you really want to attend so you can sort of plan ahead. I know a lot of you guys are the same wonderful people that are always able to show up here live and do all that stuff, but it's a really great thing to do ahead of time. And yeah, amazing piece of feedback, you guys. So thank you so much. What are some good daily exercises for emotional clearing daily? The emotional processing tool every night before bed. Do it for like a month or 2 months. Your brain will just get so programmed with seeing the world through that perspective of emotional clearing. And it's like you'll be able to do it in real time throughout the day as a result. It's the thought reprogramming. I also call it the thought reprogramming exercise in the emotional mastery course. And it shows up in a bunch of other places. That's what I highly recommend. That's an amazing question, Rachel. I have so much to say about that topic, but I think that what happens is that people have a lot more emotions that they don't realize are the effect of other people. So I would say a lot of the time people say that it's not true. I've seen that in many cases where I've worked with people in client situations, and they'll tell me situations that they realize they feel all these feelings, and then we look more deeply into it, and it's actually like these underlying wounds that are popping up there. But I do think in some cases, but very specific cases, a lot less than people often say, we are picking up on like gut feelings and our own internal response system to situations. But that's a very insightful question. And yeah, it's a lot, okay. Sometimes we can pick up on like fear from other people. I've heard stories where people like right before they've seen, I'll answer this question in a little more detail. There's a great study at the HeartMath Institute, and I've tried to find it online to show it to people all the time. And it's a video. I think it's on the HeartMath website. And what they did is they actually took participants and they hooked their brain up to little electrodes. And they also measured with devices like their breathing and heart rate. And they would flash these images on a screen of pictures that were either like really beautiful and calm or scary, like sort of frightening pictures. And it was the craziest thing because what they found is that participants would have emotional responses to the pictures they hadn't seen up to 2 or 3 seconds before they had seen them. So I think we have this like intuitive thing that's happening, maybe because the participant in the room knows the next picture. And so we pick up on different feelings. I think that can happen. But I would say so many times that I've had conversations with people who are like, oh, I'm very empathic. It's, these different things. I pick up on all these people's feelings on the subway or the streetcar, or, and then we dive into it and it's like people are feeling judged by everybody on the streetcar. People are feeling anxious. And I think sometimes when we don't do enough of that deep work to recognize that our emotions are our emotions first, then we have a hard time distinguishing between what are our gut feelings or sort of deep intuitive insights that we do have access to, I think, on some level, or there's a lot of scientific research to even back that up, versus what are we exactly, like you're saying, what were your words exactly? I lost where your comment was. Yeah, wouldn't it just be their own unhealed core wounds saying hello and projection? A lot of it's just the way people are interpreting things and their patterns, and they're so close to their face. It's like sometimes they're so close to us we can't see that they're ours, and that's what I see a lot more often. So great question. Maybe those people don't have emotional boundaries. Exactly. That's one of the most common things that I see when people have mentioned things like the public places, and I take on all these feelings and all these different things. And sometimes I've joked with different individuals that, sometimes people are just so concerned with what everybody's thinking and feeling and experiencing around them and how they're being thought of. And maybe they have a high need for approval, or maybe they're very codependent, and that happens to flow into their relationships with all these other people around them. And a lot more of the time, it's actually our individual space first. Yeah. It's a really great point that you raise. So, okay, I'm going to let you guys run. These are wonderful, wonderful questions. Thank you all so much for being such wonderful contributors to our community, and honestly to my own personal learning journey and healing. Like, I'm constantly learning just through the questions you guys are asking and putting more patterns together. And sometimes I see all these I've had all these case studies and experiences, but sometimes it's really beneficial for me to put these things into words. And so thank you all so much for being here. And thank you for the work that you guys are doing out in the world. And I hope you have an amazing night. Bye, guys. Bye, Jamie and Kim and Shayna and Rachel and Anna and Halima at 2 a.m. and Paul, good night. And everybody else, we will chat soon. Thank you again for being here. Bye, guys.